Good afternoon and welcome to the 2021 annual conference for the National Institute of Animal Agriculture. I'm Kevin Maher. In addition to my role as founder and president of Vet Measure, I have the privilege of serving as the chairman of the board of NIAA. We're glad you could join us, and I hope you're looking forward to the next 3 days as much as I am. Throughout our organization's history, we really have advanced from a association that was really based on livestock and in the regulatory side. And what I wanted to do was just go to kind of a little background and history on our business and our association. Sorry, I'm having a technical problem here. 1 second. Throughout the lifetime of our association, we've not been a stranger to tough issues in animal agriculture that leaders in the industry must address together. Prior to our rebrand in 2000, NIAA was known as the National Livestock Conservation Institute. And we have several members who recall those days, including myself. At that time, we convened as leaders who were specifically working to eradicate specific diseases in animal agriculture through education, exploration, and trying to identify where the main issues are to move the industry forward. As our predecessor organization achieved its purpose, we paused to assess if the organization should go forward or be sunset. As well as we all know, there never seems to be a shortage of issues or topics that animal agriculture faces. So the National Livestock Conservation Institute became the National Institute for Animal Agriculture. For more than 20 years, NIAA has been driven by our mission. We convene animal agriculture experts and allies in collaborative settings to explore, discuss, learn, and develop knowledge that fosters interdisciplinary cooperation for the improvement and continuous progress of animal agriculture. Our annual conference is one of the many opportunities for NIAA members and guests to come together. This year, we were fortunate to benefit from the leadership of several individuals who planned our event. Neville Spear and Laura Wright with Where Food Comes From, Eric Moore with Norbrook Inc., Leonard Bull, retired faculty from North Carolina State University, Chelsea Good from Livestock Marketing Association, Kim Kircher, K2 from K2 Outcomes, and Brett Kaysen from National Pork Board. Thank you each for your leadership and dedication in planning this year's event. We really appreciate your engagement and the opportunity you've planned for us the days ahead. Our organization also benefits from the resources from our members and partners. This year's conference will be not possible without generous support of our partners. The next time you have the opportunity to do so, please thank the leaders you encounter from these organizations for their dedication to animal agriculture. While there are a variety of topics that we could have chosen to address at this year's annual conference, the robust conversation about the sustainability of our food system, in particular animal agriculture, rose to the top of the list. Over the next 3 days, through keynote addresses, panel conversations, interactive dialogue, we will take a comprehensive approach to exploring the sustainability of animal agriculture. To us, a comprehensive approach uses the components the U.S. Department of Agriculture has used for over the decades to define sustainability. Those include economic viability, environmental stewardship, and social responsibility. Therefore, we cannot think of a better way to kick off our 2021 NIAA Annual Conference than with Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. Tom Vilsack was confirmed as the 32nd United States Secretary of Agriculture on February 23rd of this year by the US Senate. He was nominated by President Joe Biden to return to a role where he served 8 years under President Barack Obama. Prior to returning to USDA, he served as president and CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council from 2017 until 2021. There he provided strategic leadership, oversight of the council's global promotional and research activities, regulatory affairs, trade policy initiatives. He also was in the council that helped serve as a strategic advisor to Colorado State University's food and water initiatives. Prior to his appointment, he served 2 terms as the governor of Iowa, our great state here. He served as the Iowa State Senate and as the mayor of Mount Pleasant, Iowa. He received his bachelor's degree from Hamilton College, his law degree from Albany Law School in New York. Native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Vilsack was born into an orphanage and adopted in 1951. After graduating from law school, he moved to Mount Pleasant, Iowa, his wife Christy's hometown, where he practiced law. The Vilsacks have 2 adult sons and 2 daughters-in-law. His son Doug, who's married to Janet, and his son Jess, who's married to Kate. They have 5 grandchildren. We very much appreciate Secretary Vilsack sharing his remarks today. We have a pre-recorded session, especially for NIAA members and guests. We'll kick that off now.
I'm pleased to be with you today as you start the 21st annual conference of the National Institute of Animal Agriculture. Let's acknowledge that it's been a challenging year. Pandemic's impacts on health and the economy, as well as the supply chain disruptions and trade disputes, have put farmers and ranchers in a very difficult position. One of the first things I did as secretary was to develop new channels of help and assistance for farmers, ranchers, and producers. We developed the USDA Pandemic Assistance for Producer Program, a $6.5 billion initiative to reach a broader set of producers than in previous COVID packages. This is on top of the $5.5 billion in payments to cattle, row crop, and other producers that go under the CFAP program, which was begun by the previous administration. The idea behind the new Pandemic Assistance Initiative is to create new programs that will put greater emphasis on outreach to small and socially disadvantaged producers, as well as supporting a more resilient food supply chain. This also includes the new dairy donation program, which is under development right now. That program will facilitate the timely donation of dairy products to nonprofit organizations that distribute food to persons in need and to prevent and minimize food waste. Also in the Pandemic Assistance Program is $100 million of additional funding for the local agricultural marketing program, administered by the AMS and Rural Development, which supports the development, coordination, and expansion of direct producer-to-consumer marketing, local and regional food markets and enterprises, and value-added agricultural products. USDA will do more in the months ahead to restore strength and resilience to the agriculture and food marketplace, but we can't go back to business as usual. We need to transform our food system. The general state of our food system is affecting U.S. competitiveness in a variety of ways, beginning with a financial strain and debt on and off the farm, a fragile production system that relies on intensive monoculture, a nutrition security system detached from healthy food access and choices for many, growing consolidation and the lack of competition and resilience in the ag marketplace, and a lack of equity and systemic barriers to prosperity for communities of color from farm to fork. We need to accelerate a transformation of our food system to build a fairer, more transparent food system, rooted in part in local and regional production, where small can compete against big, because a greater share of the food dollar goes to those growing, harvesting, and preparing our food. We must put food, agriculture, and forestry at the center of climate-smart practices by building new markets, including in renewable energy and bio-based manufacturing, and creating new streams of income for producers and landowners. And we must rebuild the communities where our food, fiber, and energy are produced. We have to recognize that concentration is a reality today across the food system and especially visible in the livestock and poultry markets. High level of concentration create at least three problems for fair and competitive agricultural markets and for rural America economically and socially. Expose supply chain vulnerabilities, they place downward pressure on farmers and ranchers' economic returns, and their market abuses, including unfair and deceptive practices, racial discrimination, and often limits to economic opportunity. So the questions are, how can we build resilience and fairness into our system? How can we invest in local and regional food systems so farmers have an alternative where we can build wealth and prosperity in all rural America? How can we enhance value-added markets so that farmers can earn a greater share of that food dollar? How do we remove barriers to trade and strengthen trade relations, giving our farmers and ranchers a chance to compete in the international marketplace? In short, how do we build a sustainable food system that will create market opportunities? We want the United States to be known around the world, not only for quality, safety, affordability, and reliability as it is today, but we also want it to be known for its sustainability. USDA supports the vision of a net zero economy and agriculture, which is both severely affected by the climate crisis and a source of innovative potential solutions as a great place to start. USDA is supporting and investing in agriculture and rural communities as a way to address the climate crisis, to protect our natural resources, to improve farmers' bottom lines by generating new revenue streams, decreasing energy costs, and investing in farmer-led solutions. Agriculture is indeed both a source and a sink for greenhouse gas emissions, and thus it has a critical role to play in addressing the climate crisis. And I believe that farmers need and want to be part of meeting this challenge. USDA has long invested in environmental markets and conservation incentives. It's been a catalyst in generating innovative science-based practical tools to help farmers quantify and demonstrate their environmental contributions. Our competitive conservation innovation grants support the development of creative tools, approaches, practices, and technologies to further conservation on private land. U.S. farmers and ranchers can estimate the greenhouse gas mitigation and/or carbon sequestration potential of a suite of conservation practices at the county and farm level using state-of-the-art planning tools from USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. Now we're thinking about how to expand and bolster our market toolkit using existing authorities in new ways to bring in more private investment and support the private sector's approaches to broadly expand market opportunities for U.S. farmers, ranchers, and foresters. We know the costs of ongoing climate crisis will be high. The financial and human toll of forest fires, drought, and other extreme events in the United States has been astronomical. We can't afford delay in addressing the climate impacts of and on our food system. We must do the hard work of assessing real impacts and outcomes, measurable outcomes on food and nutrition security, food affordability and accessibility, farmer and food system workers' income and well-being, and environmental indications. Finally, I want to put a call out of action to all of us in ranching, farming, and food production to help create a more just and equitable sector. Last week, I met with CEOs of some of the largest agriculture and food companies in the country to have a conversation about working together to advance racial justice and equity in our sector. Now it's an important moment in our nation's history. It's an inflection point where the public making the strongest call for action on racial justice and equity in generations. And I might say it's long overdue. An economic analysis by Citi Global Perspectives and Solutions notes that the failure to more aggressively address economic inequities has cost the American economy $16 trillion over 20 years. The USDA is now focused on creating systematic, structural, and cultural changes essential to advancing equity. I believe it's the responsibility of leaders attending this event to help us uphold civil rights, to prioritize justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and to work together for progress. We're looking for partners on this journey for racial equity and for transformation of our food system, and I hope you'll join us in this important, challenging effort.
What a great way to begin our conference, 2021. As you can imagine, Secretary Vilsack receives countless requests to speak, and we're very much appreciative of him taking the time to share some opening remarks with us. Thank you very much, Secretary Vilsack. I often seen sustainability depicted as an equilateral triangle. Each side is equally important in forming the strongest geometrical structure. While all three components of sustainability are intermingled, for our purposes, we will focus on one component per day of our 3-day conference. Today, we dive into the economic viability of a sustainable animal agricultural sector for our food system. To begin our conversation, we'll hear remarks from Duane Cantrell, Managing Partner and CEO, Fulcrum Global Capital. You can find Duane's full introduction in your annual conference program. Now, let's hear Duane's remarks, Economic Viability, the Foundation of Sustainability.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to address the National Institute of Animal Agriculture on the subject of sustainable ag. I am Duane Cantrell, the managing partner of Fulcrum Global Capital. Fulcrum is a Kansas City-based venture fund solely focused on investing in disruptive technologies in the global food production industry. We invest in global agriculture, production animal technologies, and including the ag supply chain. We look for new discoveries that will improve production or yield in a sustainable or regenerative way, while replacing 60+ years of yield gains from chemicals and antibiotics. We look for discoveries that will reduce food waste, where nearly 35% of our global food production is not consumed. We also look for technologies that will improve food safety, food security, and provide traceability and transparency in our food supply. A point of distinction for Fulcrum is that our investor base is mostly, well, people just like you. They're ag operators and producers. They represent over 3 million head of beef production a year, about 1.5 million head of swine production, and then lesser representation in dairy and poultry producers. But they farm over 400,000 acres of crops, plus significant grazing, grasslands, and pasture lands. In addition, ag banking, ag trucking, ethanol production, implement and irrigation dealerships as well. So a little bit who we are. Now let's talk about the sustainable agriculture of the future. But first, I think we need to address that we have a series of what we consider food industry megatrends that will affect how we do ag over the next few decades. First, global population growth. Today's global population is around 7.5 billion people, and it seems inevitable that we will reach 10 billion by 2050. While total population is growing, rural populations are forecast in that same time frame to remain relatively flat and possibly even decrease. Other megatrends beyond global population that we think will have an effect on agriculture is a rising global middle class. That middle class will be demanding more and more complex diets, more protein, more caloric intake. Third is limitations of resources. We see the future with less land available for agriculture, less water, and less labor force. Urbanization, as those people are growing globally, the rural population is remaining flat or decreasing. And finally, the rise of technology. Again, whether that is automation, autonomous technologies, artificial intelligence, or machine learning. Each of these trends are driving the need to increase food and protein production by 70% over the next 30 years. So with that foundation, let's start with what is sustainable ag. If you ask probably 100 people what their definition of sustainable ag is, they'll probably get close to 100 different answers. For purposes of my discussion today, I would offer this rather simple definition, that the sustainable agriculture is to provide the consumer needs or demand for food without compromising future generations' efforts to meet their needs. So generally speaking, when we see the focus of sustainable agriculture falling into three areas. One is land and or soil. Two is the environment, whether it be water or air quality. And third is the animal health, animal nutrition, animal welfare. But specifically, you'll hear buzzwords and passions expressed that center around carbon sequestration, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, water conservation, antibiotic use, or again, animal welfare. However, for all the attention and the consternation over sustainable ag, unless these practices are built on a foundation of economic viability throughout the supply chain, they will not prevail. And we will then fail to meet the increasing demand for increased protein to a growing and affluent global population. So the question becomes, how do we ensure that the inevitable march to regenerative and sustainable ag practices are built in ways that create win-win solutions? And let's start with the producer community. Let's focus on that producer. The viability of new technologies comes from a very simple kind of economic formula of production. Returns need to increase, and they come from either a reduction in input cost or an increase in outcomes. Last year, if you look at investment in the agri-food tech sector, it was nearly $30 billion was invested in startups in agri-food tech. And that number has increased since 2014 of a level of $6 billion. So in 6 years, we've gone from $6 billion to $30 billion annually in startups in agri-food tech investments. Increasingly, more is being invested in technologies closer to the producer than the consumer, closer to the point of production. And increasingly, although still a minority share, is invested in animal or protein sectors. So the bottom line is there is no shortage of monies chasing new technologies to deliver sustainable practices in the ag sector. So money itself is not the issue. Unfortunately, too many technologies targeting the ag sector are coming from very brilliant people in the tech space, but with little or no understanding of agriculture. Recently, as one producer shared with me after talking with the founder of a new production animal technology, he said, quote, he doesn't know the front end from the back end of a cow. While true, the reality is the technology has some real promise, but was initially dismissed because the developer wasn't, quote unquote, one of us. Eventually, we got the producer to become a trial site, and as a result, the technology is being improved by a partnership of that developer and that producer. Oftentimes, the view of the ag community is that we are slow to change or slow to adapt or slow to adopt new technologies. And frankly, I just don't agree. I don't find that to be how I see the ag sector. I think the problem is indeed the chasm that exists between technology developers and the producer, which leads to misguided efforts or misinformed efforts that are not worth adopting. The problem is that much of the technologies that are developed are like I call cell phone apps. So you go to your cell phone, and you can open up your app store, and there are literally hundreds of options to download to your phone, either gaming apps, but also applications that are geared towards one goal and one goal only. And that's to make us, you and I, more efficient in what we do throughout our day and in our efforts. The problem is that that focus from technology centers of building efficiency just doesn't necessarily resonate with the producer community, in my opinion. So the producer who gets up at the crack of dawn and returns when the sun sets at best, and doing this sometimes 7 days a week, efficiency, I don't believe, is the highest motivating concern or priority. Whereas effectiveness of new technologies are a priority. Simply put, will it make me more money? In other words, is it economically feasible and viable? Effectiveness, meaning that it's economically viable, is the key to, I think, to new technologies that in the world of sustainable agriculture. In other words, does it reduce my input cost? Things like improved feed conversion rates, whether that be via increased protein additives to the feed, or pre and post biotic developments that improve gut biome health in our livestock, that accelerates conversion rates or reduces methane emissions potentially. Does it reduce, the technologies reduce the time it takes to convert a cow-calf operation to stocker to feedlots from a grass diet to a grain diet? Can we shorten those time frames through technology and biotech discoveries? Can I reduce my labor cost required? Can I reduce my equipment investment required? Can I reduce my medical costs and antibiotic costs? So reducing cost makes a technology effective and makes it economically viable. On the other side, does it increase my outcomes? Can I lower my morbidity or mortality rates and therefore increasing herd survivability, either by earlier or more accurate disease detection or breeding technologies so we don't miss reproduction cycles? Gender determination technology, particularly in the area of dairy and poultry. Genetic selection technologies for things like milk quality or that are genetically predisposed for that, or genetically predisposition around a lower propensity for disease like mastitis. Herd management technologies that can replace actual fencing with virtual fencing, or biometric capture through smart ear tags that are capturing temperature and not just identification, but biometric capture that can help us understand the health and well-being and welfare of the livestock. Or traceability and transparency can produce better outcomes because of a market willing to pay for those attributes. So only through changes in ag practices do I believe we'll be able to meet the current and future demands for global food and protein production. But these changes must be effective. They must be economically viable for the producer. And the only way to ensure that is for the producer community to have a greater voice in the development of technologies applied towards animal agriculture by defining those pain points or identifying the opportunities, by being willing to be trial sites or being early adopters to new effective, meaning economically viable technologies. If we turn our attention to the other end of the supply chain, the consumer, we also need to understand the role that they play in economic viability of sustainable ag practices. So just like we talked earlier about global megatrends, there are also other factors that will influence the future of agriculture. Listed here are geopolitics. So as we look at the past administration and with the attempts to get a better trade balance, we got into a trade war in many ways with China and Premier Xi. And so geopolitics has an effect, has an impact on the future of agriculture. Regulation certainly has an effect. Administrations will come, they will go, and they all have differing views on the need for and the depth of regulation. But regulations are now global in impact and global in nature. So it's not just what we do in regulatory oversight in the United States. If the EU passes restrictions or regulatory requirements, it has an impact on our ag operations. Technology, with the need to increase productivity of food by 70%, with less resources. Technology is really the only answer to increased food production. Capital markets. So we just talked earlier, $30 billion invested in ag-food tech startups last year. So it's not so much the level of capital only that is targeted towards ag, which is growing, but it's also who is investing that will determine the technologies that are pursued and supported. Organizations like Amazon and Google are pouring billions of dollars over the next few years into agricultural, sustainable ag, regenerative ag technologies. So their view of the world, their view of agriculture is what's going to guide much of the technologies that we will be facing over the next few years. Climate change. So regardless of your personal view of the reality of climate change or the cause of climate change, perceptions of climate change are dictating today's investment decisions and dictating regulations coming on the ag industry. Consumer trends. A consumer base that's based increasingly of Gen X, Gen Z, millennials have a very different priorities in their deployment of income. And finally, that same group of changing consumers have a distrust, an underlying inherent distrust of the global food system. So in my 30 years experience in the global retail and consumer products industries, I long ago learned that consumers buy from and are loyal to companies or products that they trust and are aligned with their beliefs and their values. And they do have different purchasing priorities than previous generations. For example, they spend less on housing, for example, than previous generations. But just like previous generations, this new consumer base do and will vote with their dollars. The challenge is that the producer community is sometimes dismissive of the beliefs of this changing consumer profile. With increasing consuming power from this Gen X, Gen Z, millennial base, with an underlying distrust of the food system, they demand to know more. They want traceability. They want transparency. Those are essentials in their view of their consumption. They do, when they buy the chicken at the store, they want to know where Henrietta, the hen, was raised, what she ate, where did the food come from, what was the environment. And all those things are growing in importance to a changing consumer base. They believe that climate change is real. They believe that it is man-made and that agriculture is a significant contributor. I recently read or heard at a conference that 80+% of the US farming and producer communities don't believe climate change is real. So we have a disconnect in the view of the producer community and the view of a growing consumer base. The consumer base, new consumers, also have an underlying concern for animal welfare in the food supply chain and have a somewhat, frankly, uninformed view of your world of production. But given all that and that chasm that exists, we cannot sit by and wonder why almond milk or oat milk is displacing dairy consumption at an increased rate. We can't sit by and wonder and why alternative protein investment last year was over $3 billion. Alternative proteins, not just from plant-based sources like Impossible Meats, but insects, crickets, black soldier flies, mealworms that could be consumed for human consumption, but most likely will be, at least initially, sources of protein additives to animal feedstock. But also captured gases coming out of NASA, discovery that these gases that were captured at the space station, as they pulled those units back, there was a residual there, and that residual of those CO2 gases have a really high protein content. So now you're seeing technology in capturing CO2 and capturing methane and turning that into protein powders. And finally, there are proteins being kind of grown in petri dishes. This is microbial based, really getting at some of the contents, like really the taste of fat, as they take a microbe and they expand it, grow it, and split it, et cetera. So alternative proteins are not just plant-based, There come a number of different forms, but they are here, and they are here to stay, and they are here to grow in market share. We as a producer community need to stop just trying to tell our story better, or even legislate, in my opinion, the definition of milk or the definition of meat. We actually need to do better. We actually need to be better for that consumer base, and recognize that this consumer base is not going to be marketed, if you will, into a changed point of view. The year 2020, the year of COVID, only reinforced and strengthened the distrust and concerns for food production, food safety, and now food security, particularly in Western economies. So let me give you a quick example, not in the animal ag sector, but the crop ag sector. So last year, the USDA published a report that concluded that 95% of all baby foods consumed in the US have toxic levels of heavy metals that are injurious to infant brain and organ development. Now, in an election year, that didn't get a whole lot of headlines. But however, earlier this year, Congress held hearings on that report and published their own report, essentially pointing a finger at large baby food manufacturers, Gerber, Beechnut, and others, that they said essentially that they knowingly sold the product dangerous to infants. The following week, of course, class action lawsuits were filed against many of those same companies. Congress has now declared it will work to implement what? Regulations and restrictions on the levels of heavy metals in our food supply. Now, this is not a new problem, but one that has grown over time with residual deposits in our soils from soil amendments and fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides. And by the way, it's a global issue. There is one and only one known and proven solution in the market, technology that blocks the uptake of heavy metals into our food while increasing yields by double digit because there's less abiotic shock to the plant and begins the process of remediating the soil. The challenge is that that's a product that is not yet registered in the United States. So we cannot legislate or regulate our way to a solution, but we might be able to figure out how to fast track regulatory approval, just like we did with COVID vaccines this past year. We cannot lawsuit our way to a solution. We must innovate our way to safer baby foods. And that will be a comprehensive and integrated effort by developers of the technology, the food companies, the ag input companies, and most importantly, the producer community as trial sites and as early adopters. So while we have an enormous opportunity and a challenge ahead of us, we need to understand and embrace those global realities of a growing population, a growing middle class, less land and water and labor available, a changing consumer base with beliefs, right or wrong, that are deeply held. And while it is a challenge, it is also a tremendous opportunity. For sustainable agriculture to be economically viable, we must bridge the gap or those chasms that exist between disruptive technology developers and the producer community, but also the gap between the producer community and a changing consumer base. But if you'll notice, the common factor in both of those chasms that exist is the producer community. We need to recognize it and we need to own it. If we do not take ownership, if we do not define the needs of the producer community to the technology developers, if we do not open our operations to trials and early adoptions, if we do not embrace this next generation of consumers and work to address their distrust, we will fail in a world desperate in need of increased protein production. Thank you very much, and I'd be more than pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Duane. Very good, deep information that's useful to all of us. We have a few minutes for questions that we have from anyone that wants to put your question in the chat. Please do. And then we'll bring those up to Duane for his input. And hopefully everyone can see the chat screen. Here we go. Here, the first one is, what would you say would be the priority to address this gap? Talked about the producer gap and the technology gap.
Yes. Kimberly, thank you for your question. Being an old retailer and consumer products person, I probably focus first on just the gap, I think, first between the producer community and the consumer. I think that ultimately products are purchased when there's a perceived value or there's alignment of interest. And my concern is that we have a growing gap there of alignment of interest. So I think there just needs to be further recognition of the fact that I don't have to believe necessarily the same thing that the consumer does, but I do need to recognize that those are guiding decisions and that we need to change our focus to trying to address those issues, as Secretary Vilsack said a moment ago as well, to be responsive to that consumer base and to a changing perspective and to try to work to diminish that distrust. And I think by understanding how we pursue those technologies that help us bring that distrust down. The bottom line is that alternative proteins, for example, best case scenario, represent 10% of total consumption, even 10 plus years out. But that's still going to be a close to $4 billion industry. And so I think if we can begin to just recognize that there is a gap, that's the first step, and begin to address those with our actions, I think that's the first best step.
Very good. Question from Amy: what's the driving force, or what sparked the distrust of the egg community from these younger generations?
It's a great question, and I wish I could pinpoint a specific area. I think it's just a generational difference in priorities. And the fact that I think there is a lack of information sometimes. And so if you think about, for example, $10 billion last year alone of recalls of food. So E. coli, salmonella recalls. If you're a Caesar salad fan, you had through periods of time last year, you couldn't eat a Caesar salad because romaine lettuce had been recalled. You had that's about $5 billion of pathogen recalls, another $5 billion. These are just North American numbers of foreign objects. 19 different foreign objects were detected in our food supply last year that resulted in recalls from glass, gravel, sand, dirt, grease, rubber, et cetera. So I think part of it is that there's a fright in the media, of course, builds upon that, and there's just a concern for the safety of our food security last year when shelves began empty for the first time in Western markets, and the fact that meat processing plants were only at about 72% capacity at one point in time because of COVID. All those things about food security, which is now a new issue in the United States, which never was before. So there are a number of factors that is partially generational, but also I think just circumstantial and environmental as well in terms of the things that cause those concerns to rise.
Very well stated. And we have just 1 minute left for a final question here. What would be a key tool by which animal egg could improve and regain consumer trust? And should we communicate our story better? From Lucas.
Again, as I said a moment ago, I think it's not just communicating it better, which is certainly a great first step. It's actually making progress towards. I think, and I said at the tail end of my first segment there about producers, having producers truly being engaged in the development of technologies, being not dismissive because of where it's coming from. It's not always right the first time, but being trial sites, being involved in the development of technologies, being early adopters. And I think I use the example of the baby food situation because I think it's so analogous to the things we face on the animal side as well. And yet government's approach is, let's regulate it. Consumers' approach is, well, let's lawsuit our way to it. The only answer is going to come from innovation. The innovation's there, but we've got to find a way to get those trials in this country started as fast as possible and to get those through the process as fast as we can to solve the problem. Because you can't regulate it. You can't lawsuit your way to a safer baby food environment than we have today.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. Kimberly has a question, and we'll have to defer to later in our breakout rooms. And it's a very good question, but I'm sorry we have to move on because of time. Again, Duane, thank you for sharing your expertise and insights as we begin our 3 days of powerful conversations.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yes. And over the years, I've learned how many things, many things about my fellow NIAA members. And one insight at the top of the list is really that we engage in conversation. And those questions coming through, I know that they would continue if we had more time. So to guide us through 2 facilitated conversations, please allow me to pass the virtual podium to our Vice President of Government and Industry Affairs from the Livestock Marketing Association and our NIAA Treasurer, Chelsea Good.
Kevin, thank you so much. Our first conversation today is going to be extremely enlightening, and it's one I'm really looking forward to. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Today, we're fortunate to have 2 leaders who know intimately the role animal agriculture plays, not only in the economically viable domestic market, but also the importance at the global level. And as former chief agriculture negotiators for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassadors Darci, Vetter and Gregg Doud have traveled the world on behalf of the U.S. agriculture and food systems. You can read their full bios in your conference programs. If anyone has questions throughout, go ahead and chat those questions and ask those questions. But I might just start off by posing a question to our 2 panelists. I would like to hear a little bit about, in their time traveling internationally, how did science and value play into their trade negotiations?
Darci, I'm going to let you take it away.
Good negotiator puts the other one in the hot seat first. I'll happily take that one on. I think first of all, I think that the presentation just before us did a good job of sort of talking about what can be a mismatch of values or the way that values are influencing purchasing decisions in agriculture. And I think we're seeing that more so than ever. But I think both an understanding of the science behind agriculture and how you communicate science and risk, as well as some underlying values, both political values about the role that agriculture plays in the economy, as well as how you, the second part of the agriculture is culture. So what role farmers play, really even in the folklore of the country you're negotiating with, right, has a lot to do with how those negotiations are framed. And how much room your trading partners have to maneuver. Like I think back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement negotiations, where the Emperor of Japan made a point of, telling Ambassador Froman when he was USTR that every spring he personally plants in a ceremony some grains of rice. That it's, really a cultural part of their identity in Japan to think about the rice harvest and being producers of that product. So, the reality is that understandings of science and risk and, how in SPS measures or tariffs you might protect certain products, and then an understanding of the role that agriculture plays in the overall politics and the economy, local values about animal welfare, about the role of farms in communities, all of that is sort of baked into the sort of bigger approach behind, initial offers and requests and how you talk about ag market access.
Yeah, Chelsea, I will tell you, I learned a really valuable lesson on this topic is working for the cattlemen and all the years in animal agriculture and all our efforts through BSE days, as where we were constantly preaching, got to stick to the science, know the science. And what I realized is that in the famous words of my father-in-law, who was a career in the Army. And his saying was, and where I'm going with this is, sometimes when you talk to a country about sound science, it's like a hog looking at a wristwatch. They have no idea what you're talking about. Their first question will be, well, is that the Europeans' version of sound science or the American version of sound science versus our version of sound science? What are you talking about there? And ultimately what you learn is that they don't have the expertise, the infrastructure. In trade terms, we talk about the capacity to do this. We spent hundreds of hours with the Chinese talking about these issues. And one of my favorite stories is one of our best meat scientists and SPS people at the Foreign Ag Service was talking with her Chinese counterpart about ractopamine and hormones and beta agonists and having a delightful conversation back and forth. And at the end of the conversation, our person from the FAS said, well, yeah, and if you want to know more, just Google it. And I'll never forget. And this was the reaction of her Chinese counterpart was, well, what's Google? And this is the thing, as Americans, we assume that everybody understands the first world problems and challenges and issues and things that we think about from a regulatory standpoint. I can assure you that the rest of the world, generally speaking, just doesn't really have a basic understanding of our system and or the concept of sound science.
More than that though, Greg, I mean, I think it's often not the fact that our counterparts don't, but communicating that to the public. I mean, look at what's happening around vaccine hesitancy in this country in COVID, getting people to understand the relative risk of whether something really presents a food safety hazard or not, or is chlorinated chicken, is that gonna, give me two heads? Or is that a, common sense measure to reduce pathogens? Boy, does that depend on how that issue is first framed when somebody sees it. And once a government falls behind in that narrative, it's hard to catch up for our government as well as others. And given the politics, how hard they try to fight that battle, how much they can fight that battle, it often changes. So I think capacity is absolutely there, but I just think risk communication is hard. And food is really personal to people. So it takes a full court press on that. I think private sector, public, all of it together to improve confidence.
Yeah, and the fact that, the first reaction of any country, including the United States, is, well, imports are bad. We know what we're doing domestically in our country, but we don't know what necessarily you're doing. So the initial reaction is hesitancy. I get that. That's what we experience. We tend to use the word protectionism, but it isn't really, in some places it is, but others is just a natural reaction of the lack of understanding. And then, Darci, your point is exactly right. It's how you communicate that and the government interaction and trust between consumers and their government. And that's, again, with China, so much of it was they understood how they regulated things, and they assumed that the same processes and mentality occurred in the United States.
I think Greg made a really interesting point about a lot of people start with this assumption of imports are bad. And we're here to talk about, economics in particular. How, did either of you in your time, especially as this chief ag negotiator role, try to turn that conversation to, well, sometimes imports can be a good thing economically or for the society? How were you able to make some adjustments to that way of thinking?
Well, I'll go first, Darci, on this one. And I think our first point was, we don't have any intention ever of putting a farmer in another country out of business, number one. Number two, typically speaking, most U.S. food products that we export in the other country are pretty doggone expensive, relatively speaking, because of, it's just the nature of the beast. And I think U.S. beef may be one of the best examples in conversations with my Chinese counterpart, I said, you gotta understand, This is the Mercedes-Benz of beef. This is not what you're getting from Brazil. This is a whole different product. It is expensive. And, you know, we're really not in the business of undercutting anybody with that. We're going to sell it for what it's worth. And I think you can begin to disarm them with the fact that, well, why are we trying to sell you this product? Well, we're not trying to sell it. We're just trying to get access to those consumers in your country that will have an interest in it. That is a way to kind of change the dynamic a bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it sort of depends on the product, right? And when you look at animal agriculture and you think about the fact that what we export is not always what we eat, you know, it sort of depends on the market. Think about CAFTA and the anti-chicken leg quarter signs in Central America, where we prize the breast meat in this country, and we can export very cheaply that dark meat, which creates a competitive issue for some of our counterparts. But that's not always the case. And, you know, certainly, you know, U.S. beef in Japan, that's considered a premium product, and the cuts that we're selling there are those high value ones. It's also the case that a lot of these emerging markets are never going to be self-sufficient in you know, producing meat. You're not going to have a lot of cattle grazing in Southeast Asia. There's just not the land available to do that. And so creating a different mix of protein at different price points and helping to deliver something that their customers want from a country, frankly, that tends to deliver product that is high quality and on spec and consistent, that's not a bad thing. You know, that's fulfilling a demand. And so I think it sort of depends product by product, and breaking it down. I mean, dairy is always one of the hard ones, right? In terms of animal ag products, where dairy can meet you where you are. It can be the fanciest cheese, or it can be skim milk powder, and, you know, the ingredient in a food aid shipment. And it's kind of everything in between. And somewhere in there, there's probably a product that's really hard to get in, and there are parts of that product that are easier to get in, depending on where their dairy sector is focusing. And you know, I think that's maybe not what people think about in animal agriculture, but it really does run the gamut on how we meet protein needs in different places. And the populations in the countries we're trading with are very different too, you know, so it sort of depends on what the demand is today, what we think the demand will be tomorrow, particularly in these countries that are emerging or developing, and setting the stage for that opportunity. But
no, Darci, I think that's exactly right. Actually, this is a conversation I just had a little bit earlier today, though. When you talked about that leg quarter, you know, another challenge that we face is the Brazilians, most people in the world trade whole birds and poultry. They don't trade parts or cuts like we do. And I know in a lot of countries, when they see our chicken leg, their first reaction is, holy moly, what did you pump that thing full of to get it that big? They're not in any way attuned or used to seeing a bird the size of what we're used to in the United States. And their initial reaction is something of a little bit of bristle. What is this thing? It's gigantic. Is it really poultry? And that's kind of a funny thing too, that those kind of product differences, I think, are something that take a little time, and in some cases more time to overcome than you would like to think they would.
That's really interesting. And you're talking about your differences in products. There seems to be a lot of conversations about standardization these days, particularly standards in things like sustainability, things like animal welfare. And I'd be really interested to hear the two of you talk a little bit about what roles you see the US government, international entities, and even private entities playing as we start to create some standards for some topics, sustainability and animal welfare in particular.
Well, I'm going to lead into this, and then this goes right into Darci's wheelhouse here. So where I'm going to go with this conversation, Chelsea, is understanding the importance of the concept of codex. Now, codex was not an issue that I dealt with greatly, because we had a divide and conquer situation in the Trump administration where we had an undersecretary for trade at USDA for the first time. And that was an issue that Undersecretary McKinney took on and really wrestled to the ground, was how do we, help Codex be more viable in the international community. I know Darci worked on this thing like crazy, so I'm going to let her talk about the importance of Codex from an MRL standpoint, and the fact that other countries then were trying to take that same concept and insert things like animal welfare and things that weren't really standardized into this Codex format that were a little more problematic, or actually a lot more problematic.
So Gregg's right, that we don't have a clear standard setting body for something like animal welfare. We don't have sort of objectively agreed upon or, negotiated standards for what welfare looks like. Now, OIE does that a little bit, right? And they get into animal treatment and movement of animals and things that provide that. But beyond that, there's not really a place where we establish that, which means that concerns about that sort of leak into what are purely supposed to be sort of food safety discussions and Codex and other issues around animal safety and human health and animal health and OIE, because they're all related, right? But it's not really the overriding objective of those other standard setting bodies. But the fact is that those animal welfare standards are certainly in place with third-party certifiers, retailers beginning to mandate them, and just the overall demand for transparency. And I was thinking about this panel last night and about sort of the growing expectations around measurement and transparency, both from governments to think about things like climate change, and to mitigate climate change, the growing threat of and movement of animal disease. We have more products being traded from more countries in higher volumes. And we have a coronavirus pandemic, we have African swine fever. I mean, we're watching how those overall threats that require trade barriers to deal with are growing. We have a similar challenge then as to how we coordinate as countries to think about how we deal with them without discouraging trade or with disrupting trade as little as possible. So can we use data and analytics better to do that? Can we create new ways of sharing information? Consumer expectations are growing. You're going to have to measure your carbon, whether it's for compliance or whether it's to, compliance with a government mandate or with voluntary commitments of your retailers, so understanding your carbon footprint, agreeing on how different retailers or different certifiers are going to measure it, what's going to qualify. There's, I think, a lot of questions that to me started to boil down to infrastructure and creating the right data infrastructure, the right tools for measurement, ease of computing these things, not just to develop new standards, but also to add value, so that animal agriculture can say, I can use this tool to compile data, whether it's on my carbon footprint, on the relationship I have with my workers, on my inputs and the stats of the meat I'm producing, and report it in ways that show and allow me to tell the story, to participate in a higher value market, to differentiate my product downstream. I mean, I think that all of these different demands to meet different standards, to show commitment to those underlying values you asked about in the very first question, there are some opportunities there to use them to be a value creator as well as a compliance tool. And that really, if I were in an animal ag producer right now, I would be saying, how do I position myself to participate in these things in a way that's as seamless as possible, and lets me do that.
And not to disagree with anything that Darci has said here, because I don't mean it, but I'm going to take this in a little different direction just to give some people some contrast in terms of what we dealt with China, because I think China in this conversation is really, really important. We have to keep in mind that 2 years ago, China was importing $11 billion worth of beef, pork, and poultry. Last year, they imported $28 billion in beef, pork, and poultry. They are a huge driver in what's going on now. And I want to tell the story on traceability in our negotiations with China, because I think it is one of the most interesting conversations that we had. We spent hours with Darci's husband, Jason Halfmeister, with Carmen Rotenberg of the Food Safety Inspection Service, and myself, talking about traceability and asking China questions and trying to get an understanding of what China was really after. And it was hour after hour after hour. And we weren't convinced that they understood what we were doing. We weren't convinced that we understood what their hangup was until Darci, was probably 10 o'clock at night. That finally the head career person, the director general in the animal division, said, well, how do we know that you're not butchering a hog in the backyard and that meat ends up in China? And I'll never forget, Carmen and I looked at each other and went, oh, well, that's what their issue is. That's what they're thinking about. And the answer to that was actually quite simple. Look, all you need to know is that you will never get a box of meat from the United States that doesn't have a number on it. And the number on that box connotates what packing plant that box came from. That's a federal law. It is impossible for you to ever get a box without a number on it. And that number on that box is all the traceability you ever need to know. If you need to know more than that, we can go back and trace that more than that. But this helps you understand that did not come from somebody's backyard. And Chelsea, you know what China's response to that was? Oh, we didn't know that. Okay, then I guess we're fine.
Wow.
It was a remarkable interaction. Finally, late at night, as it was extracting out of them what they perceived to be the problem, that once we got that out on the table, then we were able to sort it out in a pretty straightforward manner. But sometimes that's the hardest part, is getting all the chips on the table.
Mm-hmm. I guess that leads me to a pretty big picture question. Clearly, that was an example of a time where what we thought China might want was pretty different than what China was asking for. What similarities and differences have both of you experienced? I might start with you, Darci, on between US and other countries, either in just viewpoints or production methods proper. What are some of the similarities and differences you've seen between the US and other countries throughout your time getting to deal with other countries?
Well, I think understanding how our systems work is key, right? Like, how do your laws fit together? Are you taking, certainly around the time where China had some really significant food safety scandals, melamine in their dairy products, there were a number of events where then China was saying, and they did revamp their food safety laws and their structure. And, really their accountability scheme was, if something came out wrong at the end and it was found out, they would try and shut down the company. But until you got there, there wasn't a whole lot of oversight. The idea of a HACCP-based system or accountability measures at each stage of production, that wasn't really there. And what you saw happening in melamine was the company would shut down and rename itself and open the next day, right? Like, there was not a change in thinking. And there's not a brand culture, which is, it was interesting as well. And it's not just in China and some other countries, this is the case too. But, the reputational damage that is done to companies in the United States if they are associated with a recall or a death, or there are good internal reasons to create a culture of safety and due diligence. And, I remember one instance, and we did a whole workshop with China on food safety structures and that sort of risk-based program and how we've structured our system. And we had private sector presenters, and a person from Cargill presented, and the first slide was the pledge that every new employee at Cargill signs, whether they are the janitor or the CEO, that says, I am personally responsible for the safety and quality of all Cargill's products. And, really imbuing in everybody who works there that this is a product that people consume, and protecting that safety and quality is paramount. And when they read it out loud, some of the Chinese attendees audibly gasped. And they had just never really thought about that before. And so, I think the whole way we market our food products, the way that we regulate is different than in some other countries where the responsibility for that safety is at every sort of step of that process, and we have worked in accountability. And so when it comes to negotiating with other countries, their access to the US market and vice versa, just getting to that discussion about equivalence and how you would get to equivalent outcomes can be somewhat challenging sometimes if they start with the end product and not having those step-by-step sort of parts of accountability working back. I will say though, and don't want to go on too long here, that there is a perception, I think, that the United States is one giant factory farm, and that scale in and of itself brings safety problems. And there may be, frankly, different problems in the US system than there are in a different system. That doesn't mean that those other systems don't have their own problems that you have to think about and watch for. But there are prevailing concerns that the reason we use pathogen reduction treatments is because everything we've done to that point ignores safety, and it's a band-aid measure at the end. I mean, you hear that talked about a lot in the UK and in Europe, that if the whole system were slower or more deliberate or, not so big, they wouldn't have to cut corners and, kill those germs in the end. I'm not sure that food safety outcomes bring credence to that theory. There have been some, pretty big issues in Europe too. But there are, I think, real perceptions around the structure of our agriculture that we have to be prepared to talk about why we've structured it that way, and those can be challenging at times. Let's just say.
Darci, I will tell you, I was instructed years ago about the cultural difference between the US and the EU on issues like this, and it was described to me that Europeans are chemical phobes and Americans are germaphobes. and we perceive the fundamental basic aspect of food safety differently because of that cultural difference. I think that's true. I actually think there is a lot to that point. But I want, Chelsea, if you'll give me an opportunity here, I was, really getting geared up to go do battle with the UK on some of this stuff, and really disappointed that I didn't get a chance to get in there and go. But I learned something on antibiotics and the difference between the US and the UK on poultry that I want to share, because I've remembered this as I had conversations back and forth between the countries to understand what are the differences, what is it, what really are we talking about, and nuts and bolts. And the differences are fascinating. And I want to emphasize, I'm not saying any of this to really disparage the UK, other than just explain that there are huge fundamental differences in the two countries and how we do these things. First of all, the UK, and I think it's true for the EU as well, Darci, they do not consider ionophores as antibiotics. In the United States, we do. And in poultry, I think some 40% of what we use is an ionophore. So that's number one. Well, that takes 40% right there of the difference. Boom, just in the definition of what you call an antibiotic. The next thing that is really interesting is in terms of measuring antibiotic use. In the UK, they measure antibiotic use by actually what is used on the farm. In the United States, we have no such measurement, as my understanding. What we measure in terms of antibiotic use is actually what is produced by the drug company. And we don't take into account what's expired that is never used, that sits on the shelf and gets thrown away. And God knows from the farm when I was a kid, there was a lot of stuff that had been in the refrigerator for years that eventually got just thrown away. But you had it there in case you needed it. And so that's a second, I think, really, really big difference. The third difference is fascinating in that in the UK, the veterinarian community is trained that you want to prescribe a lower volume of antibiotic. And so the way I've described it, and this may not be completely accurate, but they're prescribing something more similar to a Z-Pack versus in the United States, we're giving a calf a big old sulfa bolus that, has a lot of volume and weight to it. So by virtue of that difference in volume and weight, the perception is the United States is using a significantly higher quantity of antibiotic in the animal. That's just not true. It's just the difference in the compound that is being used. And my frustration with that is, wait a minute, we're talking about antimicrobial resistance in humans. If you're going to use something closer to a newer technology or something that's closer to a human antibiotic to get the volume down, that's actually facilitating antimicrobial resistance versus using old sulfa-based kind of chemistry. So these differences to me are something that we are completely out of touch with in terms of explaining to consumers how this works. And I think it's a fascinating thing to discuss.
Darci, did you have any experiences on antibiotic use or antimicrobial resistance that you'd want to make sure you shared with the group as well?
Not specifically. I mean, obviously, one of the things I focused on in Codex was getting approval for the ractopamine MRL. And that, again, wasn't, at the end of the day, a lot of that was around consumer acceptance for the use of growth promotants and whether people felt that that was appropriate and caused animal welfare concerns. And it was, really a question of food safety versus other elements kind of creeping into Codex. And I think I would say from that, I think Gregg is right that how we talk about, how we measure use of particular compounds, methodologies, we're sometimes talking past one another because we're talking in a shorthand and not seeing it. And then I think that capacity issue that Gregg mentioned earlier is also, really critical, and that we have a number of trading partners who really rely on some of those international standards to say, can this product come in or can it not? Is it safe for consumption and is it not? And the slowness of our international institutions, because of some of these bigger debates that matter to people and to consumers that deal more with the production method side, are sometimes getting in the way of really important decisions just about provision of protein and provision of products. And that's I think a longer term issue that we need to work on in animal ag around how do we help countries make good food safety decisions that really affect access to and affordability of product in the near term. And then how do we have some of these bigger discussions about production methods and concerns consumers might have, and do so in a way that's objective and transparent as possible. And if consumers want choice there, how can we provide that without, again, jeopardizing the way our institutions do their jobs?
That makes sense. I have a question that was asked by the audience in chat that I'm going to share. We get our news information through the media, red, blue, or purple, delivered in sensational sound bites, and often that is not totally correct, but the deliverer may not know anything about it. Animal ag has not been very good communicator in sensational as well as true sound bites. This is not a new issue, but it's real and it's here. Do you have any thoughts about animal ag struggling to communicate sensationally?
I would just say
that's Darci's business. I'd love to hear what she has to say.
Well, I mean, part of it is that animal ag has to, And I think our previous speaker on, really engaging in some of the questions that consumers have around what is the carbon footprint of your product and how do you manage waste and what are the trade-offs you have to make as an agricultural business where you might want to invest in the latest thing to do X, but it just doesn't pencil out. I think more transparency and not less. It's not the instinct. I think that farmers will say, oh, consumers could not possibly understand how hard it is to farm, or doesn't look very pretty in a slaughterhouse or, in a muddy field or something. And we don't know if consumers can take it or want to see that or whatever. But I think people want to see that this is a work in progress. And I think it can be very effective for farmers to say, I have set a goal myself to do these 10 things to be a better environmental steward. And I hope to do them all this year, but I can't. The price of milk is X and I only have so much to do this. So I chose this first, or I want to, every business does that. But I feel like there's this tension in agriculture. On the one hand, we want to be sort of revered as the keepers of this rural culture, and we put farmers up here. But on the other hand, we just want people to understand we're a business like everybody else. I think we have to be willing to kind of let folks peek behind the curtain a little bit and show the trade-offs that farmers make every day because they care about their cows, but they can only do, so much in 1 year, or they care about the watershed. And so they're investing in this way. But a methane digester doesn't make sense on a dairy farm of 400 cows. So what can they do instead? And how long might it take to get there? In my experience, farmers are very thoughtful, resourceful. I think my entire farm is held together by duct tape. Like our machine guys, like MacGyver, they find a way to get things done to keep the operation moving, to support their families, and for the long-term health of the industry. And I think people appreciate that, but it's not always a comfortable place to be vulnerable for ag because we feel like we're misunderstood. So I think we have to find a way to kind of get over that and have a more frank conversation that, we're not perfect.
I couldn't agree more, Darci. Chelsea, the story I would tell is for 25 years, I've lived in suburban Maryland. And for 25 years, I've gone with my wife, who's an optometrist, who has all our friends, both the couples are college educated and the women are, medical reps or drug reps or whatever they are. And invariably for 25 years, I have found myself at some point in the evening pinned up in the corner of the kitchen with a group of very smart ladies asking me, okay, Gregg, we read this about this kind of food, something, something, something in this women's magazine. We know it's complete nonsense. What's the real story? How does this really work? And just question after question, just pounding it. And by the way, the worst are the women's magazines. I don't know how that is, but I get that sense from 25 years of conversations of misinformation coming there. And they want to know, just tell us straight up, how does this work? Darci is exactly right. We've got to do a better job of saying, look, this is the way it is. And there are a lot of smart people in this country who say, you know what, we get that. We're comfortable with that. We're, and the fact that you're working on it and getting better and improvement, that's all we need to know.
It's a good message about being a little bit more vulnerable, transparent, getting over ourselves and being willing to share information that can lead to some dynamic communication, but it's not easy for everyone. So I appreciate that message from both of you. I have another question that came in through the Q&A. The question asker says, I'm a newly graduated veterinarian. This AMR topic is extremely sensitive to producers in my state. What evidence is there that antimicrobial resistance in animals leads to increased antimicrobial resistance in humans? And how does this concept impact international trade?
The fact that you're a newly graduated veterinarian and they didn't teach you that in school and you're still asking me that question scares the daylights out of me. Where is the conversation in school about the answer to that conversation. Where's the risk communication in Darci's term in our educational process to help a veterinarian? You're the one that needs to be explaining the answer to that question, not Darci or I. Come on, folks, let's go.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that is how will your decisions on what to prescribe and how to counsel your clients, your patients, how will that affect their ability to market their product and to achieve the health outcomes they're looking for? If that's all the kind of things that you need to know or to think of yourself as part of that beginning journey of a product and its viability. I mean, there's really a link there. And certainly the public health implications and relationship to our food system couldn't be more apparent or more on people's minds than it is during a pandemic. So this is not we're not accusing you of anything.
No, it's just you asked the question. I'm going to give you my straight up answer to this. By the way, I will tell you, I was pre-vet at K-State. Some of my best friends are veterinarians. I've had conversations with them about this. These guys have been in practice 30 years. And one of the conversations they had was with a dairy in the United States. I won't give too many names. Explaining to a young European regulator the kind of vet drugs they used in that dairy. And she said, well, can I see your drug cabinet of what are the drugs that you use here in this practice or with this farm? And he goes, absolutely. He went over and opened the cabinet. And what would you think that European regulator's reaction was, Chelsea? The reaction was, that's it?
Sometimes when we're willing to be vulnerable and kind of answer the questions, we get a more positive response than maybe we were afraid we were going to.
That's exactly right.
Right. And I do think there are good questions there about what are these drugs for, and you get to things like organic equivalency negotiations where, real concern about antimicrobial resistance and broad use of antibiotics. That's more of, for weight gain and, for general prophylactic use being a real concern in the US. In the EU, where that's not as much of a practice, the idea that you can't use antibiotics in organic, they consider inhumane. That, where you have an animal that is suffering and needs an antibiotic for treatment, that would be required as part of the animal welfare and the protocol in organics there. And that's an area where we still agree to disagree, right? Like in the United States, if you're treating your animals, it's not that organic agriculture doesn't treat sick animals, but they have to be taken out of that organic production. And again, the concern was broad use of them, not for treatment, but to, help promote faster weight gain and things was not something that organic could accept. And in order to be able to enforce that, all organics came off the table. Europe thinks we're crazy for doing that because, of course, part of being a good farmer is also having compassion for animals who are sick and really treating them appropriately. And so, your starting point in these negotiations makes a big difference as where you end up with what's acceptable. But, I think when it comes to antimicrobial resistance, to go right back to the specific question, that the issue is not going away. And the regulations around it, I think, watch where Europe is going now. It absolutely will have a bearing on marketability of those products. And, that's a key thing that from, the farmer, the vets, et cetera, on down need to be attuned to. What are your options for making sure that you have healthy animals, but also are thinking about broader public health mandates, throughout. The issue is definitely not going away.
Great perspective. Unfortunately, we're running towards the end of our time here. I do have another question that was asked a couple of minutes ago, so I want to at least get that in before we move to our break. What do you think the U.S. should and could do to help developing countries improve sustainability in animal agriculture? So what should the U.S. do to help developing countries improve sustainability in animal agriculture?
Well, I think we're doing a lot today in the Foreign Ag Service. There is enormous efforts on capacity building. I think one of the really unique conversations that's going on in the world today is in the context of the U.S.-Kenya free trade agreement and negotiation, and the fact that we basically consider this a pilot project, folks, where we have to work with a country in Africa for the very first time to build the capacity to get our two regulatory systems in sync well enough to do a free trade agreement. Now, that is a free trade agreement that certainly will not have all the bells and whistles of a USMCA. But nonetheless, it is something that the whole continent of Africa is watching. They want to see how this develops. And if we can get that done, get that right, that is a template that we can use throughout the continent. And I think it really, really changes the dynamic for a key part of the world here, because on the other end of that, the Europeans are all over the world right now peddling this farm to fork initiative. We've got this EU Food System Summit that is going to be anti-meat big time. And so we have to be able to help countries build that capacity. You know, that's the term we use in trade, is capacity. It means so many different things in terms of expanding the education and ability to understand how to regulate.
Yeah, I mean, I think one key word here is just investment, right? And the other is market access. And we've had trade capacity building programs for a long time to try and help other countries participate. We've provided them tariff preferences, but the biggest complaint when it comes to other countries around this is, you say you're going to help us trade, and then you set SPS standards that are so high that we can't meet them. And so I think really focusing on not just building capacity of individual producers, but then thinking about the regulatory and the enforcement regimes and how they can sustain a system that both meets key sustainability markers, but also the demands for human health, and helps them think about, from production all the way to marketing, what is a successful model? Because sustainable isn't sustainable if it's not also economically rewarding to the farmers who are engaging in it. So I think that's important. And then second, if I recently taught the sort of trade academy class at Georgetown on the SPS agreement and the ag agreement, and just kind of the basics, and it really made me go back and read that an obligation of members is to help encourage the participation of developing country scientists in the development of our international standards. And if countries are going to use those standards, they have to feel like they own them and that they can trust them. And so really investing in the scientific capability and the participation of food safety, animal health, production scientists, and that community in the creation of our international rules-based system, so they can then help to bolster it and make sure that they use it, I think is a key area where we need to do better as a government and a private sector.
Well said.
I absolutely agree. And while I could listen to this back and forth conversation for hours, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the time we have for this panel. Ambassadors, thank you both. I think NIAA members and guests, as we begin a conversation about our sustainability of animal agriculture in our 2021 annual convention, you've given us several insights to think about and several challenges I think that we'll continue to come back to as we talk the next couple of days. At this time, we're going to have a brief, it was supposed to be 15 minutes. We're going to do a 10-minute technology and bio break. So please stay logged on. We're going to begin our next facilitated conversation at 3:45 p.m. Central Time. So we'll be back in 10 minutes at 3:45 Central for our next panel discussion.
Thanks so
everybody.
much.
Back as we continue to better understand the importance of economic viability, I'm pleased to be joined by two animal agriculture experts that bring great insights and experiences to this conversation. Between John and Kim, they've worked in about every sector of the animal agriculture supply chain, where it begins on the farm and the ranch. They've worked with NGOs and governmental bodies, with allied industry and processors. Kim is the Director of Sustainable Livestock Systems Collaborative at Colorado State University. John, I think, is on week one of a new role. He's now the Chief Economist for Ranking Member Bozeman on the U.S. Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. We're going to have an opportunity to ask some questions of these panelists, but first we're going to give them a chance to share some slides and some of their insights. I believe, John, you're going to go first and provide a little bit of your perspective from the economic side, as with and with the Senate Ag Committee as well. Morgan, on the slides, I think I'm seeing Kim's first.
I'm happy to present Kim's slides if she's okay with that.
It's a really good slide deck. Think they'll get them flipped over here pretty quickly.
Sorry, Chelsea, this is JJ. We had it reversed that Kim was going to go first. My apologies.
That's fine. Do you want to go with that? If it's okay with you guys, go on the fly. Kim, are you all right going first?
Yeah, that's fine. Let's start. Let's go back. Okay. Oh, maybe I can't go back. Maybe I'm controlling it, huh, JJ? Hold on. Hold on, everybody. My apologies.
Yep, you should be able to advance.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks for having me. Welcome to this part of the program. So I think based on my bio, you know, I'm not an economist. I think I'm one of the non-economists, certainly of today, but we had a great setup from a number of presenters, and I'm going to be sort of taking certainly an economic kind of lens as we talk about sustainability, of course, but I am a trained animal scientist, so absolutely a biologist by training. So if I veer off, I apologize, but I'll do my best to kind of stick to this economic pillar. So as we start, and we had a great setup kind of talking about the great challenge of our time and the tremendous population growth that we are going to see heading into 2050 and beyond. And I think it's just really important to note here that as we put this through an economic kind of lens, that we really need to be focused on the 1 billion people that are currently living in hunger and undernourishment, and then the growth where we anticipate this, the growth we anticipate where these countries are really going to grow. And what we're going to see is not only sort of an increase in population growth, but we're going to see these developing countries really expand from an economic standpoint. And as such, we expect their demand of meat to really increase. And so economics are really driving a lot of the demand growth that we're going to see when it comes to meat production. So if we look at that, the UN right now is projecting pretty extreme growth in all of the animal source foods. So anywhere from meat to dairy and eggs. This shows an increase that we expect by 2050 in poultry, pork production, beef, sheep and goats, and egg production. And again, most significant growth here you actually see in poultry and pork production. In addition to egg production is pretty impressive. So I think just, again, really grounding ourselves that, you know, the economic development and growth that will be pushing this demand drive is really important when we think about sustainability. And then, of course, balancing that with those environmental and social pillars as well. In the US, it looks a little bit different as we look at current kind of annual consumption of meat production by type. We've actually seen a decrease in beef and pork production since the 1970s, or consumption, I'm sorry, here in the US, and an increase in chicken production, which really kind of takes us back to the last panel that we heard from, which is just how important those export markets are to our animal agriculture industries here in the US, specifically those livestock industries. And finally, I'm going to kind of shift gears now into more of a sustainability talk. I think, you know, it's really important that we recognize the tremendous transformation that this industry continues to take on without really blinking an eye. And if you think about the way the meat case looked, I mean, my goodness, even just 10, 15, 20 years ago to the meat cases of today, just look at what this consumer has at her fingertips. And as a mom, I see tons of convenience elements here, which is just really impressive. But if you look deeper, you're going to see tons of protein options. So we talked a lot about organic options, natural options, never ever options. And we as an industry have really evolved to meet those changing demands of our consumer. And sustainability is probably one of those particular areas where we're still trying to figure out what that looks like and how we do that effectively and with authenticity in a way to really enhance the way this consumer feels as she buys that product. So I think oops, sorry, I'm a little trigger happy here. I think there's a lag. So when we think about the tremendous work that the industries have done in the space of sustainability, each animal protein now has a life cycle assessment. This is porks that we're looking at here that shows an improvement over time. This particular LCA looks at 1960 to 2015, where the pork industry has seen a reduction in water footprint by 25%, a reduction in energy used by 7%, a reduction in land use by almost 76%, and then a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 8%. Just really tremendous work that these industries have done here. And then just also, really, I think speaks to the leadership role that our industries have taken in terms of actually benchmarking this and then identifying opportunities for improvement. I think perhaps what we've done a little bit less of a good job at is really helping the consumer to understand what all of that means. So this picture is intended to kind of show a really confused consumer. And I think that they are really confused when it comes to these elements of sustainability. Some of that is because sustainability in its sort of nature is so complex. The other reason for that is that these animal agriculture food systems are the most complex food systems in the world. So when we layer those sorts of things together, it becomes challenging to really connect with these consumers. Sustainability is also extremely emotional. So when we talk about sort of the science behind sustainability, I think it's important to note that in the sustainability space, science and emotion are absolutely parallel. And perhaps we haven't treated them like that, right? So we've been going kind of at this with this very scientific approach. And I don't think we've done a great job really identifying with those emotional elements of the consumer. So so why is this important? Well, consumers, and we've heard this a number of times when we peel back these economic kind of elements of sustainability, the millennial absolutely puts their money where their mouth is, right? And 75% of them believe that their investments can influence climate change, and 84% of them believe that their investments can help lift people out of poverty. And so this consumer is really asking for us to demonstrate that not only from a scientific perspective, but also in a really authentic way where they can actually drive transformational or positive change in these spaces of sustainability. So the question kind of becomes, right, how can we align to the new consumer and credibly advance our industry forward? And I think that there's a tremendous amount of excitement, and I'm really excited about it too. We're seeing an administration change here in the US. We're seeing the potential to really talk about livestock. We heard Secretary Vilsack talk about it earlier today, really talk about livestock, animal agriculture in general as being part of the climate solution. And one thing that, I think from an economic perspective that's really exciting through the sustainability lens is that our agriculture systems, and I'm demonstrating rangelands here with cattle grazing, do a tremendous amount of work for us in the space of ecosystem services. And so globally, rangelands store 20% of the world's soil organic carbon. That's tremendous, right? And these cattle out here grazing, they're the ones that are protecting that. They're allowing that land to be functional in the space of a rangeland system. They're providing, not only food, but they're paying property taxes, they're keeping whoever owns this land, their livelihood thriving, et cetera. And so as we think about connecting to that new consumer, this is pretty credible stuff, right? Actually becoming the solution to climate change. And when we talk about how important carbon storage is in rangelands or agriculture, and we start to go through how it is we protect that, I think we get really credible really fast. So we can preserve rangelands and avoid conversion. We can restore cultivated and degraded lands, and we can practice adaptive management. And there's economic drivers, right, to each of those three practices. And I think then underpinning this, there's a tremendous economic opportunity to monetize that in the form of ecosystem services, and understand that while it, certainly we're protecting and storing massive amounts of carbon in that rangeland, there's other things that ecosystem is providing us: wildlife habitat, water storage capacity. One of my personal favorites, and I think when you think about economics, is really important: rural community well-being and rural economies, right? Those things that really kind of underpin not only America, but our agriculture and food systems. So now we're going to shift gears a bit and talk about what's going on in the corporate world to really connect with that consumer. And I think I skipped a slide again. This thing's a little jumpy. Okay. And so what we've seen in the corporate world is pretty impressive company commitments. And those companies that are most relevant, I don't want to say Coca-Cola or Amazon aren't relevant to agriculture, but the most relevant companies to agriculture are in that top line. And we have seen tremendous company commitments develop in the past year to a year and a half, with some of the largest food and agriculture companies, not just making a commitment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by a certain percent, but making a net zero commitment. And those net zero commitments range from carbon net zero to climate neutral commitments. I've kind of got those there. It's tough sometimes to tell even what the company is wanting to do, but we're seeing these tremendous commitments being made in the corporate space as well, in agriculture and then outside of agriculture. And I think there's some interesting ones to note who are outside of agriculture, specifically BP, an oil and gas company, actually making a commitment to climate neutrality. So actually looking at ways to make oil and gas a part of that solution. And so we're seeing this tremendous trend, right, where there is an authentic and kind of bold step towards really merging, in my opinion, economic and environmental sustainability in a really strong forward-looking way. And so many of these commitments also align to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, that they're claiming this decade to be the decade of action. And you're seeing these goals start to transcend through global sustainability programs and also corporate programs. There's a number of here that are very economically focused. I think it's really important. The UN has done a nice job, I think, in keeping this pretty balanced. And so why is all this happening? So certainly it's a connection to the consumer. Certainly it's a connection to kind of this broader global strategy that the UN is really putting a lot of, I think, power and kind of, pressure behind. But there's also a significant growth happening in what we call environmental, social, and governance assets. And so what we saw during COVID was actually an increase in investments in these assets that companies were putting forward. And so why did we see this tremendous growth in ESG? Well, believe it or not, these ESG assets actually performed better than traditional assets, right? So not only are we seeing this kind of pressure coming from consumers, pressure coming from government and other influential political agencies, but now we're seeing a tremendous return on investment with from these investors who have invested in these environmental, social, and governance type assets. So what makes something ESG? Right now, it's all just around transparent reporting. There's not even really an expectation of performance, but companies who are reporting according to these standards, and there's a number of them, that's all sort of being figured out too, which one will be the standard, et cetera. But companies who are reporting more transparently around climate change, anti-corruption, board issues, sustainable natural resources in agriculture, executive pay, et cetera, those companies who are reporting that are considered to be ESG and then can be invested in from these sort of ESG assets through that asset lens. So what does that mean? So what that means is that the economics of sustainability have changed. drastically. It from an economic perspective, that's the right thing to do. And there's usually a payback from that, right, that we see. And we've proven that time and time again from kind of a science lens, that as we invest in sustainability, there'll be improvements on the environmental side that result in performance increases, et cetera, et cetera. But what we're seeing now is that this matters to businesses in a different way. What we see now is that sustainability programs increase people retention. Companies that have strong sustainability programs see less turnover. It enhances brand reputation. There is work that has been done that suggests that strong sustainability programs enhance the resilience of supply chains. There's tremendous pressure coming from investors, consumers as well, actually, really paying for this and willing to spend more for these sustainable products. So what does that mean to animal agriculture, or what does that mean to agriculture in general? There's about to be a new flow of money coming in through the lens of sustainability. And I see it through sort of this brand reputation piece, right? This real need to identify and connect authentically with consumers, but also through this investor piece, this ESG piece, which will unlock potential for additional investments from companies. I think that it's also should get the attention of our agriculture supply chains, right? So often what the message will be in these ESG investments is that the status quo is no longer good enough and that transformational change is expected. And they will begin to start to drive whatever that transformational change is, right? That's expected or needed down the supply chain. So that's going to look very different. I think sustainability has, in animal agriculture and agriculture more broadly, has been very much driven from the bottom up. I see this as being kind of an inflection point where we might start to see it be driven from the top down through this lens of economics. So what does this mean more broadly? For me, I really think we need to focus on a shift in strategy, and not just in agriculture, but a real shift in strategy for everyone, associations, government, consumers. We all need to kind of go from defensive to proactive, where we really come together to address the greatest challenge of our time. And from an agriculture lens, we've got to be able to demonstrate credibility to connect emotionally with them. And again, science and emotion are parallel in this space. So Chelsea, that's all I've got.
Great, Kim. Really appreciate those perspectives. Now we'll turn it over to John, hear a little bit about his economic perspective and the perspective of Senator Bozeman and the Ag Committee. And then feel free to start sending some questions into chat. After John wraps up, we'll send questions both to Kim and John.
All right, let's see if I can get this screen working. This is my third day on the job, by the way. So I just figured out where the restrooms are. I just got my computer working. And then I spent all day today putting together some slides for this conference. And before I get started, Chelsea, you guys reached out to me when I was still at American Farm Bureau to participate in this conference, and I did speak with Team Bozeman here, and they graciously agreed to let me continue to participate in this event. But the only thing I'll say to everybody is, if I get out of my lane or too far out on my skis, please take that into consideration as I give these remarks today. There we go. So I think as we've heard, throughout the conference today, climate change is at the center of things right now. And it's certainly at the center of what we're doing here in Congress. I've been here, again, like I said, for 3 days, and every single day we've been working on something climate related. We just saw yesterday the Growing Climate Solutions Act was introduced. So we've been working on climate issues here on the committee for quite some time. On Team Bozeman staff, I'll tell you, they've got an excellent staff of policy experts, lawyers, and one pretty bright economist working on some of these issues. But when we look at livestock in general, you can see in terms of greenhouse gas emissions here in the United States, the ag sector represents about less than 10% And when you break it down by the various sectors of the agricultural industry, enteric fermentation, less than 3%, manure management, approximately 1.2% for this group. You add those two together, livestock emissions represent less than 4% of total U.S. emissions. When we look at soil management, we're around 5% of U.S. emissions. But the possibilities are great for farmer engagement on these issues. But there are also some very, very daunting challenges to make sure that these markets work, that they work right for farmers and ranchers, that we have the right voluntary incentive-based tools to achieve the climate goals. One of the other things we also know is that farmers are already doing a lot already. When you think about agricultural productivity, we've increased our productivity by 150 times since 1990. Inputs have remained mostly unchanged. Even though agricultural emissions have increased by about 12% since 1990, when you take into consideration our productivity gains, per unit emissions are now down more than 20%. And we're seeing more companies, as Kim indicated, starting to set up these voluntary environmental credit markets. They're being developed to help farmers offset costs for new practices that may mitigate emissions and sequester carbon. When we think about what farmers have been doing, in many cases, some farmers in my previous life I talked to have been doing some of these things for decades. But when we look in 2017, no-till or reduced till was the top land use practice in the United States with more than 200 million acres. We know that these practices can help reduce maintenance and fuel costs, but there are some additional challenges that farmers could potentially incur in terms of increased weed management costs or plant disease risk. Nevertheless, we do see that conservation tillage is the topsoil practice here in the United States. We also saw in 2017, 15 million acres planted to cover crops. That was an increase of approximately, I think, 50% from 2012. So the use of cover crops can help improve the soil quality and sequester more carbon in the soil. The challenge with using cover crops is there's a significant upfront investment for the farmer. They have to purchase the seed, they have to get the cover crop planted. If it's successful, there can be benefits down the line in terms of reduced fertilizer or herbicide costs, again, if that cover crop is successful over a multi-year period. But there are significant upfront costs that farmers do need to incur to implement some of those soil practices. And then we've also seen conventional soil management has declined sharply by about 25 million acres over the last 5 years. So farmers are doing more to improve the soil health, and they're doing more to sequester more carbon in the soil. And these voluntary markets that we're seeing being developed are only going to help farmers do even more if we provide the right voluntary incentives for farmers to do that. I think one of the challenges that we know on the livestock side especially is the challenges of benchmarking and then measuring and verifying. And what I mean by that is, measuring livestock-based emissions can be pretty difficult. If you're on a cow-calf operation on 15,000 acres, how are you measuring the enteric fermentation from those animals that you have on the farm? It's probably a lot harder than if you were on a feedlot to measure the emissions from the animals. So what's the benchmark for those operations? Are you using an actual emissions reduction, or are you trying to model it? So that's a very difficult aspect to capture in terms of these voluntary markets that are being developed. How do we provide the right incentives for farmers? But how do we benchmark it so that we know what they've achieved and what what they should be paid for those offsets that they've achieved? I think one of the other things that we need to think about, we've heard a lot about nutrient management in livestock, feed additives. I don't know if we've seen this research done, but how does the change in livestock productivity, how is that impacted by different feed additives? For example, is there an impact on milk per cow? Is there an impact on the components that are in the milk in terms of the fat and the protein content? Is there an impact on the yield growth for cattle or hogs? If in any way these livestock additives reduce the animal productivity, then what's the balance? What's the trade-off? Because you have to add more grain-consuming animal units to offset the protein or meat decline that you've experienced from nutrient management. So we need to study that. We need to analyze that balance and see how that impacts things. Because if you have to add more grain-consuming animal units, that means you have to, grow more livestock feed. So the offset that you achieve through nutrient management may not be achieved if you have to add more livestock to produce the same amount of proteins. I think measuring and verifying carbon on farms associated with certain agricultural practices can be difficult, and it can also be fairly costly. I think we know that. We've seen a lot of verification programs being stood up, and there's a significant cost associated with implementing many of these practices. And in my previous life, I'll tell you, a lot of times the costs associated of implementing these practices fell on the backs of farmers and ranchers. So we need to make sure that those along the supply chain stand up and help farmers and ranchers. We know that coming out of the farm economy that we've been in the last 4 or 5 years, things have improved the last 2 years. But a key component of all of this is economic sustainability for the farmer and rancher. They can't go broke implementing all these new practices, and I think that's a critical piece of the puzzle that we need to figure out. And then the question comes up on what's the role of government, and I think that's a very good question that we should be asking ourselves: is what role does the government, what role does USDA, what role does Congress play in helping achieve some of these climate goals? And we saw one of those roles yesterday with the Growing Climate Solutions Act. What's another thing that we've been doing for quite some time? The Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill has a conservation title, and the conservation title spends billions of dollars every single year on working lands programs. Here you can see EQIP and CSP outlays going back to 2009 have increased by 70%, I think, since 2015. We're now spending about $4 billion a year on working lands programs. So I think the focus should be on working through our existing voluntary programs in the Farm Bill as the basis for any climate-related agricultural policies. One challenge, though, when it comes to Farm Bill time, if you want to plus up these programs, you got to figure out where you're going to get the money from. And so, that's something that policymakers are going to need to think about as we approach the 2023 Farm Bill is how do we pay for a significant expansion in working lands programs if we want to expand CSP, expand EQIP. It's important to also recognize that there are other USDA programs that can be used to help achieve these goals. You have rural development programs and the energy programs that can foster a greater uptake of climate-friendly decisions and investments for rural businesses across the country. And then another one I know that many on the phone or on the Zoom are very well aware of is the regulatory review process. It needs to be accelerated. We need thorough and timely approval of new technologies that can be implemented and used on the farm to reduce emissions, to destroy methane or keep carbon captured in the soil. But one of the things you need to get that new technology to go through that regulatory review process, you need more public and private sector investment to develop the new technology that we're going to need to achieve some of these climate goals. So the public and the private needs to come together to help develop that frontier technology. And I think when you think about the role of government, it's also important for government to not get in the way. And we've seen successful efforts in the private sector in efforts to reduce carbon or destroy methane. And here we see the dramatic expansion in methane digesters across the United States. We now have over 260 operational digesters in the United States. That's private sector investments to develop those digesters. And they're destroying the equivalent of 5% of methane every single year through these digesters. So is the private sector able to successfully expand these practices, and what's the role of government in that capacity? And I think one of the very important questions we should be asking ourselves is, should government be setting the standards? Or should we let the voluntary marketplace establish these standards? And that leads into what we did yesterday with the Growing Climate Solutions Act. It provides an opportunity for the government to play a role in the certification of third-party verifiers to help farmers adopt more practices on the farm, and that's very important. But what we don't want to see in terms of the role in government is tying these voluntary climate-based practices into existing farm programs such as Title I, such as farm lending programs, or such as crop insurance. And you can see here the number of corn acres that we have enrolled in crop insurance has increased dramatically over the last several decades. We've now got 94% of our corn acres that, quite frankly, are dependent on crop insurance as a key risk management tool. It's important that we don't tie in voluntary climate smart practices into the premium ratings or into anything else that would potentially disrupt or reduce the effectiveness of the crop insurance programs or the Title I programs or the farm lending program. So keeping those voluntary conservation programs separate from the other titles of the Farm Bill, I think, is going to be an important conversation, again, that we're going to have leading up to the 2023 Farm Bill. But probably the most important thing, if I can stress anything enough, is we need to find a way to do it in a bipartisan way. We need to work together. I think if you bring Democrats and Republicans to the table, you bring the input of the ag committees, both sides of the aisle, together, all four corners, we can achieve our climate goals, and we can work to improve policies that are being considered. For example, with the Growing Climate Solutions Act, Team Bozeman worked in a bipartisan way with the Stabenow team to make a number of key improvements to that piece of legislation. One, they bring farmers and ranchers to the table. So they added a section in the Growing Climate Solutions Act that creates an advisory committee with at least 51% of those advisory committee members have to be held by farmers and ranchers to help advise USDA on how they're going to implement the Growing Climate Solutions Act. It ensures farmers are treated fairly, so it allows for estimates of costs and benefits of new practices to be provided to farmers so that farmers know what they're getting into, and then it also ensures that farmers have an equitable share in the revenue that's generated from these carbon markets. So that's an improvement that was made in the Growing Climate Solutions Act. We also made an improvement to help protect farmers' data. It ensures that farm level and personally identifiable data will not be released. You know, any of that information that's captured on the farm to identify how much carbon you've sequestered or how much emissions you've reduced from livestock, that's the farm level data. And we're going to make sure that that's not released on an individual basis. Any release of that data has to be highly aggregated so that it's not personally identifiable. And finally, we made sure that we protect existing farm programs with the Growing Climate Solutions Act. It provides funding to carry out the program, and it avoids reopening the Farm Bill and making adjustments to the agricultural amendments. So there's money in the Growing Climate Solutions Act to protect farm programs, and that's pretty important too. But, you know, to wrap everything up, you know, after 3 days on Team Bozeman, I can tell you that working in a bipartisan way is a huge priority. It's how we're going to get these things done, and it's going to be something that, you know, again, like I said in the very first slide, we're going to spend a lot of time in this Congress working on climate issues. So with that, Chelsea, I look forward to taking any questions that folks may have. And any of the economic stuff, I'll defer to Kim.
Well, we've got a question from the panel already, and thankfully, Kim, they're not asking you to do any economic equations, but it is an interesting question, and that is, does this emphasis on sustainable animal ag work against the world's need for more food to feed the growing population. If companies and government impose too many rules or expectations, could that limit a farmer's ability to produce the needed amount of animal protein?
Yeah, I can take the first stab at that. So it depends is the answer to the question, right? So I think the one thing that keeps me up at night is the standards that are informing a lot of these ESG or kind of company commitments are also rooted in this shift that sort of the shift that we're seeing in consumers, right? That they are asking for what I like to call free from products. So free from those sorts of technology. So we would say, you know, there, for example, in an ESG standard reporting, a food company would get more credit for having a plant-based food option in their portfolio, and it would be more credit towards a more sustainable program, right? So yes and no. No, because I do think there's a really strong, you know, I mean, kind of the time is now. I think, you know, everybody is talking about agriculture being a climate solution. You know, kind of this notion of traditional agriculture production is getting some attention right now. Efficiency seems like it's beginning to kind of gain some traction. Efficiency combined with better practices is getting, you know, even more traction. So I do think that we're in a little bit of this time period where we might start to see some of those things shift or at least come back into balance. And I would just echo what John said. I mean, not only should this be kind of a bipartisan initiative, but I would really caution everybody to not say my way of producing food is better than yours. And what I hope comes out of this is not a, you know, a challenge where we can't produce more with less, but that everybody is sort of in their own, you know, they're on their own journey, and they also have their own constraints within whatever food production system that they're working in, right? And that everybody is just trying to improve that and gets credit for it. And hopefully there's some additional kind of funds for that too, to incentivize that sort of adoption of better practices or good practices, or, you know, whatever it is that we come forward with. So I think it's your good question. The answer is yes and no.
John, do you have any thoughts you would like to add on that particular question?
Well, Kim answered that like an economist, a two-handed economist. Yes.
Thanks.
Yes and no.
I was going to call her an attorney because she said it depends, and that's always the answer if you ask a lawyer a question.
You know, so I'll take it. I'll look at it from a different perspective. I think there's a balance here in terms of, as I said in the presentation, if some of our sustainability efforts or some of our efforts to reduce emissions means we need to add livestock, then you know, it's like a scale, right? So you reduce some here, but you raise some over here. The other thing to think about is globally, right? If we're, you know, if we're doing all this here, but around the world they're not doing the same thing. And we actually saw today in the press, and I don't know who from China, but they basically said, United States, you can go ahead and join the Paris Climate Accord, but it's unrealistic to expect that we're gonna do all of these climate and sustainability things. And when you look at global CO2 emissions, right, from the United States, global CO2 emissions from fossil fuel production, United States, Europe, North America, it's going down. Asia, it's going way up, and it's on an exponential curve. So again, there's this scale here where we can do a lot here to go net zero, or potentially reduce our emissions. But if it means folks around the country are going to deforest the rainforest more quickly, to put in more crop ground, or use less efficient production practices around the world, we're not really achieving our global climate goals. And that's John Newton, that's not Team Bozeman talking. So I'll just put that out there as well.
Dr. Newton, it looks like we've got another question in the chat, and it's directed towards you. Question is, do you anticipate a climate change or carbon sequestration component of the next farm bill? If so, will it, in the kind of a separate question, will it include potential payment, and will farmers have to implement new practices, or will current practices, things you were talking about like no-till and conservation programs, be eligible for payment particularly?
Well, so, and I think that question came from Ernie up in Michigan, from Michigan Farm Bureau, Ernie. He's chasing
Someone's
me.
getting called out. It's neutral on my end, but I like picking on Ernie, so we'll blame it on him.
So, you know, on the voluntary market side, these companies that are being stood up, they want you to do more, right? So if you've been doing no-till for 30 years, Ernie, you got to take it to the next level. That's what they're looking for. In terms of the farm bill, you know, we've already got a conservation title. We're spending a lot of money on EQIP. We're spending a lot of money on CSP. That money's used for all sorts of projects, whether it's nutrient management projects, livestock-based projects, cover crop projects, conservation tillage projects, and those do provide financial and technical support to farmers, Ernie. In terms of, will this next farm bill include just a direct payment for practices? You know, the next farm bill's quite a ways away, and so I'll have to say mum's the word, Ernie, because I don't know the answer to that after 3 days.
Sounds like it depends is the answer to that, like it is to every question.
Well, I think the other thing I'll point out, and this is John Newton again, the next farm bill won't be written by this Congress, and that's an important component to also note.
Well put. One last question, and then we're going to turn to our final speaker for the day. You guys talked a little bit about monetizing benefits and what monetizing benefits for some of these sustainable practices might look like, but you also talked about how there is a cost to these practices and that there is a cost to verification of practices. Is there a chance that the payment or what people are willing to pay doesn't square up with the potential payment for the practices and the verification as well?
Kim, do you want to go first?
Go for it.
I'll copy off your answer.
Yeah, go for it.
You know, so that's a great question. You know, some of these practices do require an upfront investment. You know, cover crop seed or planting the cover crop is a good example of that. And when I would talk to farmers, you know, as we plant more cover crops, so I'll give you a really good example. The market facilitation program that was rolled out to help producers impacted by retaliatory tariffs paid a $15 per acre payment if you planted a cover crop. Well, what do you think cover crop seed prices did? They went up. So, you know, you can't look at this in a vacuum and say cover crop seed's only going to be $15. We're planting 15 million acres of cover crop. If you were planting 30 million, 50, 60, 80 million of cover crop acres, and, you know, cover crop seed prices would go through the roof. So the economics are not stationary. They're dynamic. And I think that's important to note when you think about this. And then one of the other things is how much carbon are we actually capturing in the soil? And Kim's shaking her head. So I think I'm on to something here. But if you're capturing less than a metric ton per acre of carbon and you're only getting paid $20 a ton, you can do the math there. And, you know, where's the bang for the buck on capturing carbon? It's a real tall forest somewhere that does the best job at sequestering carbon in the soil. So I think there's more questions than answers right now. We've got a lot of work to do in Congress on these issues. We got a lot of work to do in industry with farmers, with ranchers. And I look forward to the challenge, and I know we've got a great team here at Team Bozeman to do so.
Yeah, really well said. The only thing I would add to that is that the consumer isn't willing to pay for that, right? They will absolutely, feel better about purchasing, and they believe that their investments can help, but they are not going to go out and pay for a verification program, right? So I get asked that question all of the time. Well, what if we could just verify that we had sustainable beef production? Well, that adds a lot of costs to the system, right? Whether it's in the third-party verification, even if you're not actually changing practices, even if it is just status quo, we're adding cost and verification, we're adding sorts and packing plants, we're adding SKUs and packing. I mean, it just complicates everything. And so that adds a cost, and that cost that adds is more than the consumer is willing to pay, right? Now, the risk is they shift away from a commodity if they don't feel like it's meeting their expectations in the sustainability space. The other thing I would add, and I love John's comments about the carbon market, because it's another one that keeps me up at night, because I don't know how we reward farmers and ranchers who have been doing a good job, right? So the rangelands are the perfect example. Many times those rangelands, especially arid rangelands, aren't going to sequester more carbon. If they've been intact for 100 years, they're storing all the carbon that they can, right? I mean, they're sort of in that perfect static space. And as long as you're not abusing them from a grazing perspective, there's not a lot of carbon flux, there's not a lot of carbon, increased carbon storage. But that's still really important. Carbon, right? And more important than that is the other things that rangeland provides us. So rural, economic strength, wildlife, water. I mean, the list just goes on and on from an ecosystem services standpoint. And I have big dreams that we'll come up with some novel kind of market-based way to incentivize this that actually looks at a comprehensive approach to sustainability. So managing all three pillars, the right way, that actually pulls risk out of the operation when there's an implementation of this kind of comprehensive, management. So in other words, these sustainability programs do what we say they're going to do. They're going to improve environment, they're going to improve these social aspects, but they're also going to improve profitability or risk mitigation or whatever that looks like for that operation. And that we'll be able to monetize that in some way on, kind of through a market or through some sort of novel market-based system. What does that look like? Does it look like a reduction in ag lending rates? I don't know. Does it look, I don't think we have a lot of answers to those questions. It's been shocking me the 5 months I've been back in academia. We actually don't know how even rural community well-being or strength is linked to the well-being of our farmers and ranchers in those communities, right? So that kind of the ROI back to this really strong rural community, we don't understand it. And so that's a big, we need to study that. We need to understand what that is, and sort of how, to John's point, how this dynamic system, that there's this sort of push and pull, and what levers do we have to push and pull, and have wins on multiple fronts.
Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. John, Kim, thank you both for sharing your expertise with us. You bring a lot of different pieces together, and I think gave us a lot to think about. To complete our conversation on the economic viability component of sustainability today, we're going to hear from Erin Fitzgerald. Erin leads the team at U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action, an organization that has been the champion of the sustainable story for farmers and ranchers, while also leading the Decade of Ag movement, which calls on food and ag leaders to collaborate towards its vision of a resilient, restorative, economically viable, and climate smart agriculture system. And you can see Erin's full bio in your program. I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
Hi, everyone. So excited to join the National Institute for Animal Agriculture. I want to say special thanks to JJ Jones for inviting me today. What a fantastic agenda that we explored on the day one, really looking at the sustainability and the economic business case. I'm really excited, having seen all the panels, that it's a group of friends. I hope you're all doing well. I know we're all still joining each other in digital Zoom box. But today, I hope that we can really talk about leaning in no matter what to make the business case for action, leadership, and collaboration. You know, when we've talked about sustainability over the last decade, I think many of us have been challenged to figure out, what does it mean? What is the economic business case? And more importantly, how do we measure it? And what is the science to support it? And many of you have been on that quest over the last decade to help us realize more the sustainability impact associated with our sector. But what I want to talk to you today is that this is no longer business as usual. We have seen over the last 4 harvest seasons disruption and crisis that has devastated our agricultural output. We are losing 83 acres of farmland per hour. And if you can imagine that farmland is our potential to protect green spaces, sequester carbon, enable flyways, we are providing some level of ecosystem services that we are all trying to measure. And then we're increasingly faced with those extreme and episodic events, forcing our agricultural system to really weather the so-called weather the storm. And at the same time, our farmers are receiving 8 cents per dollar, the lowest ever on record. When we think about the sustainability as our grand challenge, we have 30 harvests to get it right. Each growing season, our farmers are faced with an innovation curve that is unprecedented. Each growing season, each harvest season is a chance to get it right. So it requires innovation and accelerated investment at scale. Our sector is already doing incredible things. We've reduced our climate impacts through science, new technologies, precision agriculture, that is telling us that we are on a trajectory to have our carbon footprint by 2025. Here you can see the National Academy of Science study that is really modeled out, if we continue on our current trajectory, that we are likely to have our carbon footprint. But what is incredibly exciting is to imagine the potential of this sector to not only reduce our carbon footprint, but also be net negative carbon solution to a transitional economy for a net zero economy, meaning that we would be the only sector that can not only reduce its footprint, but have a handprint in society. That is our agricultural sector. That is our promise. And to fulfill our potential, we must accelerate innovation and economic growth into the sector to meet that grand challenge for us to fulfill our potential. And there is a tremendous opportunity ahead of us. With ESG investment growing at $2 trillion per annum, my question is, why isn't our sector seen as the sector where green economic growth is happening and a promise for rural revitalization? In other words, if you believe in environmental social impact, this is the sector where innovation happens. And the consumer is also looking to this sector for solutions. In COVID, we saw many consumers, we already know that everyone was always taking selfies and photos of their plates at dinner. But during COVID, we saw an increase in that as consumers increasingly saw the connection between farm and all the different people across our sector to deliver food. We did not have a food crisis. Our food system bent, it didn't break, but we saw the incredible power of the sector coming together to ensure and deliver on our stewardship and our commitment to provide nutrition and food for the sector. Coming together during COVID taught us that we must keep our sector together from farm to fork, that there is a sum of parts, that it's not just on our farmers, but all the entirety of the supply chain to deliver on solutions. We must work together to co-create the sustainable food systems of the future. In 2019, we gathered 100 C-suite leaders into a hot barn in Maryland, and we asked to experience boots on the ground reality and asked a very simple question: where are we going as a sector? And isn't it time that we work together and lean in? We had no idea that those leaders would be asked to last year to truly work together day in and day out. And in September of 2020, in the year of action on climate change, and having experienced COVID and the real realities of the need for collaboration, we asked leaders to lean in and design and affirm a vision for the future, with the goal to mobilize unmatched sector leadership, put farmers and ranchers as the solutions of change at the center, lift up and mobilize and build on our prior actions as individual organizations to catalyze momentum for the sector, with the goal to multiply and focus our innovation and investments for the future. This vision is bold. You can see here, we want a resilient, restorative, and economically viable, climate-smart agricultural solution. That if we are successful in that, it will provide abundant, nutritious, natural fiber, clean energy for a vibrant and prosperous America. Over 18 months, every word was carefully chosen. Here you can see the iconography, which is a teaching tool. And behind this are shared outcomes and guiding principles for how leaders can work together towards that future. My favorite is the icon in the center, which you see that our carbon cycle and our ability to provide food, and through the integrated animal agricultural system, we are able to upcycle and convert to other food stuff. The other thing you see in this circle is that we also create many byproducts that become co-products that can ultimately unlock the power of a bioeconomy. And the way to think about this is that we want everything to come from the center, from the surface of the earth, rather than the center of the earth. And that we can truly, agriculture, unlock the power of a bioeconomy to fundamentally displace fossil fuel or black carbon. This vision is bold, and we had over 300 different leaders craft that vision. In 2020, got 98% alignment. And now it's the power of stepping up and affirming and signing on or endorsing that vision to create a fundamental alignment of strengths and to ask every organization, leader in action, what are you doing to put your strengths to work towards this common vision? We launched this on Ag Day and are asking all of you to look at your organization, take a minute and to look at the vision, the guiding principles, and the action steps. These are our first 30 first movers on Ag Day. And this week, as we enter into Earth Day, you'll be seeing a few more announcements. Our goal, and encourage you here to look as both an organization to step up and step out towards that vision. And we're also calling on individuals, change agents, to really take a look and say, you know what, no matter what in my career, for the next 10 years, I am going to put my strengths to work towards this common vision. It's a very simple process: review, and then write an endorsement letter. We have a form there that you can sign, and really it states that you are committed to work towards this shared vision. And then there's a paragraph that we ask that you explain how you're going to put your individual or organizational strengths to work. Our goal is to catalyze unprecedented leadership in the year of action on climate change. What other sector can solve for action than the food and ag sector? That is why it is called the Decade of Ag. In the Decade of Action, it is this sector where sustainability happens. It is this sector that not only has the know-how, the innovation, the potential to solve for climate change, but also we have the people, the heart, the stewardship to get it done. With 15% of the American workforce connected to food and agriculture, we truly can be the sector where action happens. Here you can see this year is a very big year for the food and ag sector. As many of us have been aware, and some of us, if you're not big time, this is a big moment for agriculture. We have often said that we want to be recognized. We want to be leaders. Others don't understand what we're doing. Well, for the first time, the UN has put the food and ag sector as front and center. Many of you might remember the Rio Global Compact Summit. If you don't know about sustainability, you do know that fundamentally changed the conversation on renewables and carbon for over a decade. Starting in September, the UN during Climate Week will be taking on the sustainable food systems of the future. The United States has an incredible opportunity to lead in and demonstrate leadership. It is our intent to bring those leaders into action on this topic. In September, we will be convening leadership again, and in the fall, being prepared to enter into those conversations. So it's not enough to just have a vision. We fundamentally need to transform our sector to realize that vision. As part of the Decade of Ag, there are 3 action tracks to help us mobilize and realize those goals. The first is the Ag Climate Partnership, unlocking unprecedented science and data to rapidly get it into the hands of our farmers. The way to think about that, I'll explain a little bit more in just a second. And then transformative investment. This is really looking at the next decade. Do we have enough capital injected into this sector to help propel it for new science, innovation, and economic growth? And then finally, making certain that we are truly telling our story in a unified engagement plan that lifts up and demonstrates the potential of this sector. So the Ag Climate Partnership recently, about a week ago, launched and rebranded itself as Ag Mission. This is the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, the foundation arm of USDA and farmers joining forces to create this unprecedented solution. A way to think about it is that 20 years ago, the healthcare sector, doctors and patients said, we need to create an unprecedented goal to end cancer. And they stood up an organization called the Human Genome Project, which fundamentally connected science and data in an unprecedented way. It created a data protocol and sharing to advance the field of science rapidly for our doctors and patients. Very similarly, we are doing this now for the food and ag sector. In this example, FAR is the colleague or same equivalent as NIH, and U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action is likened to the medical and doctor and patient community. We are currently mobilizing to create a data protocol to mobilize the science community, of which many of you are part of, and to eventually be able to have solutions to deploy for our farmers. The idea is that we can rapidly develop collectively a private public database which all scientists and proprietary innovation and startups and tools can leverage. And then finally, the action track on transformative investment. We did not know over the last year prior how much money was actually moving into the sector. And the real question was it enough? If we imagine the next decade and we truly need that level of scale of growth, then we must look at making certain that we have the economic engine to fuel that level of innovation. This report was published on February 9th, and it really looks at the startup community and engaging the financial community to propel the economic innovation engine for this sector to fulfill its potential on its ability to draw down carbon. So here's a quick snapshot of the report. We really looked at the total innovation sector and what kind of startups are going on. I will say, for those, since we are all talking about animal agriculture, in this first phase, we have just looked at the cropping system. And in phase 2, there is a plan to expand. And we said, what is the current innovation sector, but what is not? What's not on this page? We know that the venture community is really looking into the sector, and the majority of investment funds are going to boxed meals. No surprise, is during COVID, accelerated, but also alternative protein meats. But what we found is that there's not enough investment actually going to carbon solutions for farmers. And so this is truly an opportunity to encourage innovation and investment to propel growth for the next decade. We also looked at capital flows. Previously, we did not know how much private sector was moving into the sector that can impact our farmers, and also the ag innovation ecosystem to support it. With ESG investment growing at $2 trillion per annum, our goal is to make this sector the preferred place for investment towards environmental and social economic growth. And I'll give you an example how fast this sector is moving. In Q3 of 2020, $10 billion in green bonds were issued, of which agriculture was not at the table at all. It is our intent to continue to help financial institutions to really realize that this sector is where green growth and the transformation to a net zero economy exists. You can also see that this helps us put into context the way to think about an economic engine for the sector. We've heard a lot about carbon credits, and many of us I know here today have worked quite a considerable amount on that. But carbon credits is just one stackable investment. Similar to the renewable energy sector, back in 2007, they did create credits, a credit system. So if you were Nike, you could, in Portland, where it's not very sunny, you could still become a renewable energy sector by buying credits. The renewable energy sector also did a fantastic job about creating federal and state carve-outs, incentives, and insurance mechanisms to help support the growth of the sector. And then finally, what they did, and did very, very well, is they created financial tech investment strategies that bolted alongside the emerging sector for growth. So back in 2007, I and my 401k could go in and make a bet on the sector's growth. Now, they don't always pay off until recently, of course, but you can imagine for long-term patient capital that believes in environmental and social impact, that this is truly an opportunity to grow the amount of capital that is in the sector. And then finally, telling our story. Lifting up stories in action is a key component to this Decade of Ag vision. We launched a campaign called Dirty Harvest. I would encourage you, if you have a minute, to go on YouTube and type that in, share it with your family and friends. We won a Cannes Award this past year, and very excited. Our goal is we're currently underwriting for 30 more films of farmers in action for this fall to demonstrate impact at scale. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, would love to hear more. So we do have 30 harvests, and this sector is the sector that is the most important to enable the transition to a net zero economy. Every one of you are truly leaders in action. You are working on the science, you are working on the solutions, but it is time to organize and collectively create impact. There are several ways that you can get involved. 1, sign on as an individual leader. 2, talk to your organization. about how they can put their strengths to work and lift up your current work and lean in for the future. We don't have to have all the answers, but we definitely need to demonstrate leadership. If you're interested in any one of the action tracks, I would love to talk to you. And then of course, finally, just a simple step today, would love for you to watch 30 Harvest or connect with us on social media. Thank you guys for all of your work. Get going. This is the time for action. Hi, everyone. So excited. Hi, everyone.
Well, Aaron, this is JJ. It looks like maybe Chelsea might be having some technical difficulties, so we will, we'll do an audible here. Excuse me as I get myself set up. So thank you for sharing what you all are doing at USFRA around sustainability, and of course, sharing not only the stories of farmers and ranchers, but the entire food system and chain there. So let me get the chat opened here and see what type of questions may have come in. But you know, I guess,
JJ, I'll just say I'm so sorry about the recording. I know we're all trying to struggle in this Zoom. We're all just want to give your team a digital high five. But I put the link to the deck for anybody so you can have it right in the chat. So apologies for that.
oh, no, perfect. Well, I hope we all, like you just said, give each other some digital grace that every so often Zoom or technology gets the best of all of us. So anyway, well, it looks like Chelsea may have our first question and is back online. So I'll turn it back over to Chelsea.
Well, I sorry about the muting issue. I should be able to be unmuted now. First question is, great job. How do we get more diverse audiences involved in knowing everything agriculture is already working on in this space?
I mean, that's a great question. So, you know, for us at U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action, we believe fundamentally in working with and through the value chain. So we are working with some of the top brands, top leaders. And when we think about the value chain, you know, go back to COVID, right? We finally learned, at least the consumer learned, that there's a lot of people in this food sector. So the first strategy here is everybody is connected to a supplier. So in the Decade of Ag, I would encourage you to, you know, contact your other people in the supplier and really challenge them as a leader to step up towards the Decade of Ag. Because when we were all connected during COVID, we truly saw contagious collaboration. We saw this sector lean in, and I think we need to continue to hold that mindset. Can we do it, you know, every day? And I know you guys all have contacts with those different leaders, and by doing that, I want to give you a stat. You know, we often say that the consumer we just want to tell our story. But if you were rolling out a new product in a company and you were going to go get it ready for consumer launch, the first thing you do is you get every employee in that company to believe in that product launch, right? And then you roll out the product. Now, if we thought about the food and ag sector, right, as we want to tell our story to the consumer or that mom, what would you do first? You would get every employee so fired up about what we do and we offer. So guess what? If we connect all of us together, that's 15% of the American workforce. And I'm willing to bet that if we just imagine all of General Mills employees in Minnesota, what impact that has as they start sharing and talking to their friends and neighbors. So it's very important that we in the food and ag sector stick together and figure this out as those leaders in action.
Another thing that we saw over COVID was just a lack of there are some vulnerabilities in our supply chains. How does that relate to this sustainability topic, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think so. COVID is an episodic event, stress to the system. You know, already when we were crafting this vision back in 2019, and we pulled 100 C-suite leaders into a barn, we were already experiencing, in fact, 4 of our farmers couldn't get to the event due to a tornado and flooding. And then, of course, then we saw the Mississippi flood. Last year, we saw COVID and, of course, fires. We were already experiencing 8 out of the 10 last harvest an extreme episodic shock. And I think it was a wake-up call to many of us that this is no longer business as usual, right? Now, for the other sectors, I think that what we saw was that obviously there was a health crisis. We were very fortunate that we did not have a food crisis. The food system bent but didn't break, right? But that's because we all pulled together. And so I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from COVID that it was in many cases, I've been calling it a fire drill for our sector. We had to learn very, very quickly how to work together, how to reroute. But the other thing is you saw incredible heart. And so what does it look like if we can be that sector every single day?
Very well put. I think we're going to have one more question and then need to move on to our conversation and cocktail event that rounds out the day. Aaron, how are the 30 harvest videos making their ways to consumers?
Yeah, so 30 harvests we made, we got 1.5 million actual views and 8 million impressions. And I will say that was all through organic. It was a very, as you can see, maverick film, but it was definitely shared with the consumer public and mostly through employees talking to other employees or sharing it with their colleagues. We even had many brands do a luncheon view with their employees and really show, so you can't track that obviously in social media, but they actually hosted like a luncheon view and then had a conversation about the film. So we now know that little test market worked, and we are gearing up for more stories to come.
That's great. Aaron, thanks so much. And thank you to all of our speakers and panelists today. Like many of you, I miss the networking opportunities of in-person meetings and events. So while we cannot be physically together, we've worked to virtually create a space where we can enjoy casual conversation and get to know one another better. Tonight, we're fortunate to have a Conversations and Cocktails event that is being hosted by Maiden Marketing. This event is set up in a Zoom meeting so we can utilize breakout rooms, which means we'll have to leave this Zoom webinar and click on the Conversation and Cocktails list you received. It was also just sent to your inboxes for quick access.